Now let's go to Will Brehm. He is an associate professor of education and international development at the UCL Institute of Education, University College London. His research interests include the intersection of comparative and international education with international relations and the political economy of development, focused primarily in Southeast Asia. He is author of many books, and we are so happy to have you here. Will, thank you very much for joining us and for your input.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Thanks so much for the earlier presentations. They're really thought-provoking. I'm going to talk a little bit about illicit financial flows, which is a rather large term that includes things like money laundering and bribery and tax evasion and corruption. And all of these things are connected to education in one way or another. For instance, issues around bribery and corruption is often linked to this concept of shadow education, which would certainly have big implications for the financial flows to education that aren't necessarily being captured in tax, but are being spent individually by families or individually by communities. What I'm going to focus on today, though, is more about tax evasion, because I think this gets to some of the sort of the interests and the power dynamics that David was talking to earlier, particularly of the super wealthy, those who are actually donating money. And so this focus on philanthropy as a tax avoidance strategy is sort of what we're going to look at today. And so although philanthropy is of course helpful for many social sectors, including education, even if a small amount, as David mentions in the beginning, with aid, you know, the amount of philanthropy that people give actually ebbs and flows with tax law changes. And what we start realizing is that these notions of illicit financial flows, illicit becomes the question of in whose perspective. And usually it's in the state's perspective. And so what ends up happening is there's a big tug of war about sort of changing the laws of the state, changing what the state thinks is illicit or not illicit. And often what is, you know, there's some new really interesting works on zones as sort of these smaller areas that are trying to escape any nation state laws and boundaries. So free ports, etc. These are sort of the dreams of Milton Friedman from the 1970s that have become sort of turbocharged around the world to this day. So here we are talking about states, the super wealthy are talking about zones. And so we might need to catch up with that. But first, some history. Let's go back to some of this philanthropy. So starting in the 1870s in the United States, the US experienced rapid industrialization and economic growth. It was a period known as the Gilded Age. It was also known for its massive inequality. So in 1913, for instance, the top 0.01% owned 9% of US wealth. The names of the people who owned some of this money are still known today. Rockefeller, Frick, Carnegie. They built universities and libraries and museums. They donated to countless charitable organizations, including within international development and education, even to this day. And so in many ways, these philanthropists funded social services the governments could or would not. Some in the US government actually feared that taxing the wealth of these high net worth individuals would actually burden the treasury. So they thought that as taxes increased, this logic went, Rockefeller and Frick and Carnegie, they would stop donating money to social services. This in turn would burden the government with providing services many people had become accustomed to. So this perverse logic sort of emerged. You don't want to actually tax because you want to keep the rich to donate. If you tax them, they might stop donating, covering these social services. And the US government actually went even further at the time, where they started providing tax exemptions for every dollar donated. And the strange thing is the opposite began to happen because of these tax exemptions. When the cost of taxes falls below the benefit of the tax exemption from philanthropy, donations decline. And this was most notable during the Reagan years, when President Reagan cut taxes to the point where it made no sense for the super wealthy as part of their wealth management to donate anymore to receive that tax exemption. And donations fell 50% at that time. So the good deeds of a few sort of, white men basically came at a very, very high cost. So in his early years, Andrew Carnegie, he really favored progressive inheritance tax, but he also fought tooth and nail against federal income taxes. He fought against the worker. So one scholar who wrote a biography on Carnegie wrote that, quote, Carnegie had opposed unions at every opportune juncture, end quote. And in the final years of his life, strangely enough, or maybe not so strange now, he even changed his heart about inheritance taxes. He created the Carnegie Corporation of New York, basically on his deathbed, as a way of shielding his massive wealth from the tax agency in the United States, the IRS. So he avoided a 40% tax the day he died by putting all of the money into the Carnegie Corporation of New York. Henry Ford followed the likes of Andrew Carnegie and Rockefeller by starting the Ford Foundation in 1938. And it was the same sort of logic, but with a slight twist. Ford donated his stocks of the Ford Motor Company to the Ford Foundation. This ensured that the Ford Foundation would continue to control a large share of the voting rights at the Ford Motor Company, even after Henry died. These are all the strategies that the super wealthy use. That it might sound good that they're donating all this money to philanthropy, but they have other interests in mind. And today, in many ways, is the second Gilded Age. The top 0.01% today own 10% of the wealth in the United States. Family names like Buffett, Gates, Zuckerberg are associated with philanthropy. We probably have heard about many of them. There's even something called a giving pledge circulating among the super wealthy, trying to get people to donate their money to these various big organizations as a way of avoiding tax, not going into the domestic tax revenue. And philanthropy has actually taken on some new features of late. So philanthropy often now is talked about in terms of being impactful and disruptive, sort of echoing these discourses commonly found in Silicon Valley and Wall Street. This sort of makes sense since these sectors were the most wealthy, is where the most wealth has been concentrated in recent decades. So one example of this sort of new trend is in impact investing through philanthropy, is something called the social impact bonds. And some of you might have heard about this. And so what these are is where investors, so many of them foundations connected to private companies or banks, one of them actually is UBS Global in Switzerland, they put up money for various development projects. And then if the projects hit agreed to targets, then investors earn a return on their investment. And sometimes it's on the order of 10 or 20%, which is far higher than most stocks can ever yield in a year or so. And the goal of social impact bonds is for governments to be the so-called outcome funder. That's the ultimate goal of these social impact bonds. And so governments end up having to pay a premium for certain outcomes that they agreed to, but they lower their risk because if the targets aren't met, they don't have to pay any money. But of course, who sets the targets and whether those targets are meaningful or not becomes the big question that isn't often asked. And the financiers are often the ones setting the targets, and they're guaranteed to make them easily achievable. So social impact bonds have now become part of basically wealth management strategies. Donations can fetch a return on investment while still allowing the donor to say they're doing philanthropic work. The second issue with philanthropy today that I'll highlight, and this is where I will begin to conclude, is the rise of privacy. So whereas charities often have to have public reporting obligations, private companies do not. It's much harder to understand what's going on in a limited liability company, for instance, than it is a nonprofit organization. So some philanthropic organizations actually value privacy so much today that they've incorporated not as a charity, but as a limited liability corporation. The best example of this is the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, which is the Facebook money. They registered as an LLC, and so it's nearly impossible to understand how they're using their money for philanthropy in any way. There is one good book out about what they've done thus far in the space of education, where CZI donated $100 million into the Newark public school system. And what they funded were test-based accountability metrics, the expansion of charter schools, and the datification of education systems. By all accounts, it's seen as a complete failure, but we do not know the details of this donation and where this money is coming from, and to who is accountable itself, because it's through an LLC. So both historically and today, education has been a prime sector where charitable donations have flowed. And donating to education is sort of hard to fault, right? It's if giving money to support education seems like the ultimate good. But the reasons why high net worth individuals donate to charity, to education, is usually tied up in elaborate schemes to avoid taxes and protect their own wealth. Huge sums of money flow into education, but at the expense of developing these robust public systems of taxation that David started with today. And I think this is what needs to change. And just to echo what I said at the beginning, I think one of the things we have to do is start actually moving away from thinking about the nation state and thinking about these zones that super high net worth individuals are really beginning to target. So I'll leave it there for now. I know I went over my time, but thank you very much.